Exploring Creation with Biology is part of the Apologia series of Christian homeschool textbooks. They are written in a conversational style, almost like the transcript of a lecture. I found these books very difficult to teach from because they essentially make me redundant. They're not a good reference book. If you need to know a particular detail, there isn't a convenient chart or diagram where you can find it. Instead, everything is in large, dense paragraphs, and the only guides are chapter and section headings. For a homeschooler, this is great. Read the book, learn the facts, pass a class. For a teacher, though, I had to come up with teaching resources from scratch. Fortunately, there are a lot of experiments which can be accomplished with kitchen supplies, which was fantastic for my school, which had just opened and didn't have a lab or a large budget for supplies. There was also a lab kit that you could buy from the publisher. However, when it came to lesson plans, I had to be very inventive. The book is laid out with 16 modules, or units, that are projected to take 2 weeks each to fill out a 32-week school year. Each module is broken up into topics, important vocabulary is highlighted and defined, and occasionally the text will be interrupted with the comprehension question called On Your Own. Laboratory exercises are also interspersed where they are applicable. I have to say, this is the book's saving grace because it's written for a homeschool audience, so the instructions are so clearly written that I never had any problem implementing them. Besides the inconvenience of the lecture transcript style of the textbook, the comprehension questions are answered in the textbook at the end of the unit. In other words, the book didn't contain or provide to me any homework that I could assign except for a study guide at the end of the module that has a big vocabulary matching section, but it's all the terms from the entire unit, and then a whole bunch of short answer questions, maybe like 20 or so. The problem is, since there wasn't like a topic by topic breakdown, I couldn't really conveniently assign part of the study guide every night to reinforce the material we had covered in that day. Instead, it just kind of got lumped together as one big assignment that we had to do every time then a unit ended. It was pretty inconvenient. I get it. The book was written to be compatible with the homeschool curriculum, which doesn't necessarily do nightly homework. So using it in a classroom wasn't ideal, but it made it extraordinarily difficult on me. Now, teaching physics and chemistry at a Christian school is pretty standard. I didn't have to make any alterations to my secular education to make it friendly to the school. Biology, on the other hand, is a battleground subject because of evolution. When it comes to straightforward facts, the book gets them right. I occasionally would check obscure facts online to make sure they were current and mainstream, and they always were. For that reason, I'm pleased to say that the outline I made is still worthwhile. And if you'd like to have it for your own use, it's available to my patrons. The exception, of course, is when the book talks about evolution or has an occasion to inject a creationist talking point. There's an entire unit on evolution, which I'll get to, but let's start at the beginning. The first module is an introduction to biology. My outline completely omits the anti-evolutionary spin, and I'm going to show you what that is and why it doesn't belong in a science textbook. The first 7 pages are a fine introduction to life science, ecology, metabolism, the basics. But on page 8, there's a section called Life's Secret Ingredient. The text says that the chemical components of life are like the parts, and DNA is the instructions for assembly, but there is something more, a secret ingredient that separates life from non-life. According to the book, that is, and I quote, the creative power of God. The text says, quote, science will never be able to uncover the secret ingredient that makes life possible. At some point in the future, scientists might be able to catalog every chemical that makes up a living organism. Scientists might even decode the information stored in DNA and determine all of the instructions necessary to form those chemicals into a living organism. Even after those incredible feats, however, science would be no closer to creating life. Without the creative power of God, lifeless chemicals will never become a living organism. At the time, I left this material out of the lesson entirely. I had to walk a tightrope between presenting legitimate science on one hand and not rocking the boat or raising heresy alarms with parents on the other. I want to support my students' healthy spiritual and intellectual growth, and sometimes that means protecting them from misinformation and bad argumentation. If I called out this section and explained what was wrong with it, I'm undermining the legitimacy of the textbook, which is bad for me and the class, and sowing seeds of doubt in the kids' faith because I'll have to wonder, what other ways do Christian resources bend the truth to be persuasive? So I just pretended it wasn't there and moved on. Here's what I wish I could have said. Life is not an object. It's a phenomenon. If you merely assemble the constituent parts of an organism, atom for atom, you've constructed a corpse. After all, an organism that was alive a second ago and just died is basically that. All the body parts in all the right places, DNA and everything. But it's not going to just come to life, because life is a series of chemical processes, not just structures. And if you interrupt the cycle is over. The momentum is gone. You don't need a supernatural force to make the chemical constituents of life become animate. You need those chemical structures to be in the right energy states to continue some stage in a series of reactions. Who knows, maybe that's what I did say, and I just didn't mention that I was subtweeting the textbook. After this, the book has a section on the scientific method, which is not awesome, but it's not terrible. And it contains standard Christian talking points that aren't really noteworthy, with one exception. Its definitions of scientific law and theory are not very good. However, it leads to a much more interesting section, the limitations of the scientific method. Now, on one hand, it does a good job of explaining the built-in intentional limitations of the scientific method. You know, that science only establishes reasonably true things, as far as we know, that are always subject to revision on new evidence, and occasionally may need some correction from lousy data or bad experiments. As examples, it mentions the discovery of living coelacanths, long believed to be extinct, or Pasteur and Leeuwenhoek's contributions to the paradigm shift around microorganisms. The problem, though, it's that since science can be wrong, you'd better not put your full trust in it because it might let you down. But you know what will never let you down? The Word of God, of course. Just in case you think I'm being unfair or exaggerating, let me quote the text to you. Putting too much faith in scientific laws or theories will end up getting you in trouble, because some of the laws and many of the theories that we treasure in science today will eventually be shown to be wrong. Well, if scientific laws are not 100% reliable, what is? The only thing in the universe that is 100% reliable is the Word of God. Those who put their faith in the Bible are not disappointed because it is never wrong. This was in a science book. Listen, this is how you ruin kids. You discourage them from placing appropriate confidence in science, and then from a place of spiritual authority and academic credentials tell them that everything in the Bible is true in a religious environment where that means literally true. There are only a couple outcomes. Either these kids will grow up innocently at first, but then later willfully ignorant of science, or they're going to have a crisis of faith when they see through these flimsy arguments and learn the truth. You're going to get idiots or atheists, and that is the exact opposite goal of Christian education. The book tries to correct for this with a diplomatic paragraph about how science is good, actually, because it helps us live better lives and develop useful technology and appreciate the glory of God. But you don't fix pages of heavy-handed well poisoning with a few sentences of quiet applause. Now, if you're familiar with this topic, when I mentioned Pasteur and microorganisms, you probably thought about spontaneous generation. The next section is dramatically titled, Spontaneous Generation. The faithful still cling to it, which draws parallels between spontaneous generation and abiogenesis. Spontaneous generation is the pre-scientific idea that bugs and mice and stuff basically have spawn points in real life. Like they just appear in places where food is left out and goes bad, instead of surreptitiously lay their eggs or sneak in through small spaces when you're not looking. Abiogenesis, on the other hand, is the very scientific idea that the chemical ingredients and processes necessary and sufficient for life can occur in an inorganic environment, and that the right conditions could result in a self-sustaining, self-replicating chemical superstructure that uses carbon chains and incorporates energy from its environment to maintain its chemical cycles. This section uses a common creationist rhetorical strategy. Flip the script and accuse the scientific establishment of doing all the dishonest things that they accuse creationists of doing. Frankly, it's embarrassing that this is in a textbook. It's like overhearing your parents fighting. Can't you just teach biology, please? The book actually summarizes it like a petty argument. Pasteur proves that life doesn't form from non-life, but, and I'm quoting here, those that fervently believed in spontaneous generation just said, well, okay, these experiments are wrong. However, look at these other experiments. Although we now know that life forms which we see with our own eyes cannot spontaneously generate, microorganisms can. Look, I was trying to be a good teacher, okay? I looked up the Miller-Urey experiment and looked into current hypotheses on abiogenesis. This characterization of the debate was insulting. Insulting to the decades, at this point almost centuries, of work that have gone into the question. Insulting to me as the person who's supposed to present this, and insulting to the kids that it's supposed to be for. The book describes how the spontaneous generation holdouts pushed their faith further and further into the gaps in our knowledge, into the invisibly small, to the deep past, about the intricacies of chemistry. It confidently dunks on this straw man, then predicts that eventually abiogenesis will be proven wrong. Look, I get it. There's a certain amount of Christian and creationist talking points and rhetoric that I expect in a Christian science book, especially a biology book. I mean, it's written from a theological perspective for a religious audience. It's par for the course. And I'm so used to a lot of it that it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. I just read right past it. But this stuff is different because of the attitude. A textbook ought to be an impartial, informative presentation of a subject's methodology and knowledge. This textbook sells ideology, not methodology. This is the bulk of the anti-evolution content from the introductory module. There is an entire module on evolution about halfway through the book, intended to last 2 full weeks of the school year, that deserves a dedicated review. Until then, I'd like to remind you that the teaching resources I made from this book, that's outlines of every module except the evolution one, plus a couple of other resources, are available to my supporters on Patreon. I'd like to ask you to consider supporting me because I have a lot to say about my experiences teaching science at a Christian school, and I still am a full-time teacher. As you may know, that doesn't leave a lot of room for other things, so your support can give me the practical and emotional resources to keep going. So if you value this kind of work, I appreciate your help. And last of all, if you think this is worth seeing, subscribe so you see more, like and share so others can see it, and thanks for watching.